And now today's featured speakers are Wesley Spindler, class of 2010, Camille Ford, class of 2009, MSA 2010, Gianna Manganaro, class of 2015, and newly MBA 2021, and Max Chang. Camille is an associate director at Poshmark, a social commerce marketplace for new and secondhand style. Camille is also the founder of Dear Gertrude, a slow fashion brand. Gianna is the owner of Edited by G, a comprehensive sustainable fashion company focused on creating your perfect capsule wardrobe. And as an ambassador for the nonprofit Remake, Gianna continues to educate herself and others on the atrocities of the fashion industry. For those of you who were expecting alumna Alex Giannetti, class of 2009, she has recently started her maternity leave, and standing in for her today is her colleague, Max. Max works as a media assistant at AlgaeKnit with an academic background in sociology, extensive experience in the startup world, and a keen eye for art and graphic design. Max is the driving force behind AlgaeKnit's media presence. And leading today's discussion is Wesley, a sustainability and business strategy director with Accenture and co-author of the Circular Economy Handbook. She is program director of the Circulars, which ran for 5 years as a Circular Economy Award program in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, and has just relaunched as an innovation accelerator program. So without further ado, I turn the proverbial microphone over to you, Wesley.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's really a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join. And as an alumni of Bentley, it's great to virtually be able to speak to you all today on what I feel, and hopefully you feel, is a really important topic, and especially at such a critical juncture. The circular economy and sustainability really is a key lever in how we think about building a better world and changing the way that we produce and consume in order to improve ultimately the way that we work and that we live. So before we get into the great panel discussion that we have planned, what we wanted to do is just set the scene in terms of what do we mean by the circular economy, why is it relevant for those listeners in the business world or students and beyond, and why is it important to the fashion agenda. So I'll give a few minute overview, we'll flick through some slides, and then we'll turn over to our panelists and get going. So to kick things off, as you can see here on the screen, I'd like to firstly align on what exactly do we mean by the circular economy. But to understand what we mean by the circular economy, what is our current economic system? Our current economic system is what we refer to as linear, meaning in simple terms, we extract resources and energy, we use those resources and energy to make things, the stuff that we consume, products and services. We use those products and services that we buy from organizations. And then typically these products get thrown away, or at best we might consider recycling. So unfortunately, this linear system that we operate in the global economy perpetuates a really unsustainable system. On the other hand, if you can look at the right-hand side of this slide, a circular economic system is one that really seeks to close the loop on our traditional take, make, waste model, reinventing the way that we produce and consume resources so that waste is designed out from the start, materials are looped back into the system, products are kept within productive use for as long as possible, and ultimately we move to a global economic system that is regenerative and restorative. So hopefully that helps you set the scene in terms of what we'll be talking about today. Now, hopefully if you can understand that definition, it's important now to know, why is the circular economy so critical? There's really a few key imperatives that strongly indicate the value of moving to this new model that we operate in. And the first one, and probably the most obvious one, is the environmental imperative. As I said, our existing patterns of consumption really won't support the challenges that we face as a global society. If we look at the environmental big picture, and in particular production and consumption, we're not on track. So to call this out with some real stats, resource use is set to double between the last few years and 2050, and we already consume as a global society 1.75 planets worth of resources each year. What does that mean? It means that we currently consume 75% more resources than the Earth can naturally regenerate in a given year. And that's set to go to 3 Earths worth of resources that we'll be using each year by 2050. So clearly, we've got a big problem. The second thing is the financial imperative. So besides the environmental good, models like the circular economy, embracing those in the business community, the public sector, our everyday lives has significant benefit. And if we think about business specifically, we really see circularity as a contributor to business competitiveness. Our research has actually, and by our, I speak as you know, part of Accenture, some of the work I've done, we've actually identified a $4.5 trillion potential to be unlocked if businesses start to embrace the circular economy, and that's by 2030. So there's a huge amount that can be done to use circular economy to really think about innovation, thinking about how companies and businesses enter new markets, and really build that more resilient system that we know is more important than ever. The third dimension that's quite critical when we're thinking about the importance is the value shifts. So we understand that, many of you have probably heard that the move to conscious consumption, that's been on the rise for a number of years now. And I think the pandemic has actually served to accelerate some of those changes in consumer preferences, people not wanting to waste, people seeing the impacts of some of their lifestyle choices. We actually did a survey at Accenture, which showed over 50% of consumers say they're willing to pay more for sustainable products, and that's going to continue to grow as societies really wake up to some of the big challenges we face and see these challenges day in, day out. And I think the other important dimension here, it's not just consumers, but also workforces. A lot of organizations are seeing their employees put pressure on the business and business leaders to really embrace more sustainable practices. And then the final thing to call out here is the other business drivers that are really meaning a shift in the way that we operate as a global economy needs to change. So I'll talk about one of those in a minute, which is looking at new business models, but also the role of technology is really important. We see technology as a huge enabler of bringing the sustainability agenda forward. As we are in the digital, the technology revolution right now, it plays an important part in everyday lives, but really also in terms of sustainability and circularity. So diving into actually that point I mentioned there on the business models, some of the work I've done has actually has been to really define how do we tap into these circular opportunities and really start to transform this definition of waste from a challenge into an opportunity. So you can see here on the screen different business models that different types of organizations are looking at and really cut across the whole value chain from design to end of use and act as a framework for us to be able to make some of these changes that are so needed. So the first being, I'll talk to each one. The first is really thinking about what do you input into products and services. So how do you use renewable sources, bio-based materials, for example, that are recycled or highly recyclable, and incorporate that into providing better products from the get-go. Then if you think about consumption, which I've called out on the right-hand side of this slide, there's a number of business models which cut across the product life cycle. So looking at things like how might you transform from a one-time sale of a product to transitioning to a product as a service model where organizations are actually incentivized to provide better products that last longer because they have that ownership. Also looking at models like how do you extend the use of products with the primary owner through things like repairs and so on. And then there's sharing platforms. So this is an interesting one, but how do you, instead of owning something and maybe letting that product go to waste or be idle, so to speak, how might you actually increase the utilization of what you own through sharing models? And then finally, the last, if we close the circle at the end, looking at resource recovery. So this is probably the definition individuals are most familiar with, but it's really about how do you take the embedded materials and energy and not just recycle, but think about how you can loop waste back into the system as an input to something else. So it's really about having a system that is continually circular and redesigning, using, and disposing of things in a way where they can cause less harm and ultimately do more good for our planet. So if we could just move on the slides. What I wanted to just call out next is that's all well and good, but what does this mean for the fashion industry and why is this such a critical topic to look at? So just to call out a couple points that bring this to life. In the fashion industry, currently less than 1% of clothing is actually recycled. And when we talk about recycling, that is a tricky definition because we might think we're recycling our clothing, but we don't actually know where that ends up or if it ultimately does get recycled. Another interesting point to call out more on the production side is it takes about 20,000 liters of water required to just produce a single t-shirt and a pair of jeans. So it's extremely resource intensive to produce the clothing that we wear. And also there aren't a lot of solutions out there that help really think about recycling or even upcycling or reusing products. So you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, there is a number of hotspots of wastage in the fashion value chain that really exacerbate these challenges for the industry when we're thinking about things like fast fashion and the throwaway culture. But what I'd like to reposition it as you can probably tell from some of the things I've mentioned, is how do we move from that challenge to an opportunity? And again, at Accenture, we've put a number on this, and there's actually a $60 billion opportunity by 2030 to embrace circular business models in this industry. And that's not exhaustive, that's just for a few initiatives. So a couple of things that are really important to think about in terms of this transition is how do we scale the development and deployment of circular materials? So I talked a little bit about those inputs. So how do we use recycled or recyclable materials into products? How do we innovate in new ways to provide materials that are much better for us, but also for the planet? How do we think about developing more intelligent and circular operations to really reduce waste in the production process? And how do we invest in those new business models, whether it be things like repair, rental, recommerce, and so on? So there are a number of big challenges the fashion industry faces in this domain, and there's a long way to go, but wanted to really call out the opportunities. And before I move into our panel to really bring this to life, I did want to actually call out some examples of what I mean when I talk about these different solutions. I won't talk about all these on this page, but just a couple. So if we think about design, there's a really cool innovator called Eon that actually has an intelligent RFID tag that can be integrated into garments and actually give that garment a digital identity so that it can connect the materials across the full life cycle and enable brands to really track their products and therefore have more control about what happens to it and how it gets potentially disposed or repurposed. Moving around to the top of the circle, Galley is a really cool, innovative company that's actually growing cotton in a lab from cells instead of plants. And that it's 10 times faster to grow than standard cotton and actually requires 80% less water in manufacturing. Then thinking about moving on further, I talked about those new business models. Rent the Runway is really interesting. That's a subscription-based service that lets members rent designer clothes on a rotating basis. There's a lot of different subscription models out there. And why is this so important? So the average woman actually throws away about 82 pounds of clothing per year. So providing a rental service is a really cool innovation. Many of you probably know Patagonia. They actually have a program where they take back and repair products and services, products, and they offer repair guidelines on their website to help customers make repairs from home. So they're therefore extending the life of their clothes and giving the clothes new life where they would otherwise be disposed of. And then the final example I really like is Adidas. They actually have a recyclable shoe. It's called their Future Craft Loop. It's still in development, but it's made entirely of yarns and filaments that are reclaimed and recycled from waste. And they're actually recycling those shoes and making new Future Craft Loop shoes. So the shoes will be able to stay in that continual cycle for hopefully as many times as possible. It's made with recycled materials and it can be remade into new shoes. So that's a really interesting example as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a preview in terms of some of these interesting business models. What are we meaning when we're talking about this topic? And why is this an exciting space to be thinking about when we're talking about circular innovation and really change makers? So on that note, to bring this really to life with our speakers, I'd love to introduce our really fantastic panel, Camille, Gianna, and Max. And it'd be helpful if you could each give a brief overview of what is your role, what do you do, and how does your role really relate to sustainable fashion? So I'd like to ask you each to give a bit more of an introduction, and then we'll move into some Q&A. I might ask Camille, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Wesley. I love that presentation. I feel like I learn more every time. And I think that's also just part of it, of just like we're all in this state of continuous learning. So thank you for kicking us off. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today. Again, my name is Camille Ford, two-time Bentley grad. I am currently an associate director at Poshmark. And so those of you who aren't familiar with Poshmark, it is a peer-to-peer marketplace for buying and selling fashion. And so as you think about that, the ecosystem and the supply chain that Wesley had shared, Poshmark is really focused on the re-commerce and that kind of product use part of the ecosystem and of the cycle. And so at Poshmark, I focus on strategy and expansion initiatives. So really thinking about ways to expand use and expand the business case for re-commerce. So it's really exciting stuff. And although, as you could probably tell from the MSA in accountancy, my career absolutely started in public accounting, but I've always had such a keen interest in sustainable fashion. And I would even take it more broadly, reimagining the fashion space, just thinking about it differently. In fact, my thesis was about ethical production in Bangladesh when I was at Bentley. So it's kind of funny to dig that back up. But I just think today I'm really excited to talk to everyone about how we might collectively reimagine fashion and embracing circularity as a model. So excited to be here and join the rest of these awesome panelists.
Thanks so much, Camille. And I love that word, reimagine, because I think it's so important when we want to think outside the box to really embrace not just new ways of doing business, but really a transformation of the way our economy and our systems work, and therefore how do businesses operate. So great point. Gianna, I'll come to you next. Great to hear your introduction.
Sure, thanks so much. Hey everybody, again, so excited to be here today alongside these amazing other panelists. I graduated undergrad from Bentley in 2015 and am graduating this Saturday with my MBA. And really, honestly, my journey began in college with when I was first exposed to Reformation, which now jury might be a little bit out on, but they were really my first like dipping my toe into that whole world and how much waste was created, and starting to get a peek on to the whole cycle of clothing and the process from start all the way to finish. And my background when I graduated was in nonprofit events. And so I've actually joined a couple sustainable fashion nonprofits. I'm an ambassador for Remake, which is an incredible nonprofit that really focuses on the garment worker aspect of sustainable fashion. how little they're paid, the terrible conditions they work in, really how it's contributed to fast fashion in particular. So, you know, kind of all across the board, hoping to transform that. And just recently I decided to create a business called Edited, and put my my passions and align it with my job. And so I'm really excited to sell, you know, secondhand clothes that are gently used, still in great style, still in great shape. No reason to not keep wearing them. And you know, every day I just learn a little bit more about this. By no means an expert, and I think that's kind of part of this journey, is that you keep learning a little more from other people and what they focus on every day. So excited to talk more about it.
Thank you so much, Gianna. That's a good point on learning, right? This is a new frontier, so to speak. So you're gathering from so many different areas of inspiration and where you're dipping your toes in. So be wonderful to tap into that as we continue the discussion. And last but certainly not least, Max, over to you.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. Hi, Bentley community. My name is Max Cheng. I work for a company called alumnae, which is a biomaterials company making biodegradable yarns from a seaweed called kelp. So, you know, if you kind of reference Wesley's slides from earlier, I kind of work in the sourcing part of the wheel. We're creating basically renewable and biodegradable materials. Yeah, I'm filling in for Alex Giannetti, who works as a product development manager at alumnae. I think she's class of 2009 here at Bentley. But yeah, so we call her AJ. AJ works primarily on our life cycle assessments and then kind of defining properties of our material as well. She was on maternity leave, so happy for her, so filling in for her. And yeah, I work as a media assistant, so I'm basically in charge of all of our media operations and kind of outreach as well. I hail from New York, so I'm not from, I guess, the Boston-ish area or Massachusetts. I grew up on Long Island though, so the ocean has been a big part of my life growing up, and kind of in my early career so far, I've always been involved in environmentally driven ventures, so from community agriculture to secondhand clothing resale, and now to my work at alumnae. I've always kind of worked towards an environmental end. Yeah, I mean, I've been at alumnae for 3 going on 4 years now, and really excited to be here today talking about circularity.
Thanks so much, Max. And you're certainly an honorary member of the community. So appreciate you stepping in and really excited to hear your insights. And I think it's really interesting because each of you is bringing quite a different lens to the topic, which is important, right? Because there's not a one size fits all approach, and there's a number of areas that need to be progressed and invested in. So on that note, I'll chip in with a few questions here for the next few minutes, and then we'll also open up to some of the pre-submitted questions, as well as if anyone has questions as we go along, we'll track those in the Q&A box. So to start, I'd actually like to hear from all of you on this first question. You know, we've all sort of highlighted that this is a really important area, right? Thinking about sustainability and circularity for the fashion industry, because there's some huge challenges. And the industry is in many ways can be quite destructive. And maybe that's even an understatement. You know, for example, it is one of the biggest carbon emissions emitters as well. Probably a topic for another discussion. But I'd love to hear each of your perspectives on really what do you see as the tools, the technologies, the strategies, or the approaches that can help us move away from the current state of where the industry is to one that's much more sustainable and circular. Maybe Gianna, I'll pick on you first to provide some thoughts.
Sure. I think the biggest thing is knowledge and understanding, and my gosh, it's never been easier to learn between social media and the internet and being able to, you know, just Google a question if you have it, or, you know, attending talks like this or joining a nonprofit like Remake. There are even apps. I'm actually on in another group for an app called Good Human. That's really a one-stop shop for sustainability, whether it's a scholarly article or tips and tricks on how to be more sustainable, or brands that are rated on their sustainability practices from start to finish. So I think one of the first steps is understanding, and folks really kind of realizing the detrimental effects of the fashion industry, and particularly fast fashion.
Yeah, great point. And I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because there is so much information out there, and there are a lot of opportunities to learn, but there's a lot of things which aren't quite clear.
Sure.
And things, what do we mean by sustainability?
Yeah.
Is this, when a company calls something sustainable, is it really sustainable?
Sure. Greenwashing. Yeah.
So I think it's a great point, and certainly something that organizations need to help with as well, in order to educate in a clear, simple way that helps make people helps enable people to make better decisions. So that's a great point you called out. Max, I see you sort of nodding along. Do you have perspectives on, what is important as we make this shift?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So the education aspect of it is so important. And also, yeah, understanding, or I guess better defining what sustainability means and not throwing the word around, right? And kind of, yeah, just using that as like a buzzword, basically. But I think coming from the perspective of a biomaterials company and kind of working in the field of, material, like the raw material, I guess, aspect of the supply chain, I think we're still a few years away from seeing these technologies scale. And so I think you said the word, I think earlier, like this is going to need like a collect, or something along the lines of this is going to have to be like a collective effort. And I think you said that perfectly, right? So we're all kind of working at different parts of the supply chain here. So, at Poshmark, right, with re-commerce and upcycling, and then Gianna with that fashion education aspect, and also secondhand clothing resale. These are all such important parts of closing the loop, right? So if we all do our jobs, we're going to kind of accelerate that shift towards circularity that much more. But that said, I think, it does take, effort from all parties involved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a spider web, I like to say, of different players that make it possible. And just a quick follow-up question there, Max. What do you see as, some of the challenges to scaling these so needed innovations, right? So we talked about, there's a lack of understanding sometimes, but, what really is it that can drive a scale of a business like yours that you work at? Is it, you need more investment, you need, I don't know, policymakers to understand the value, or what are some of those things that can really enable that for a business investing in such an exciting innovation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, right, so over the past 5 years, you've really seen startups and early stage businesses like AlgaeNet, but also others. You've kind of seen those types of businesses really proliferate. So I think as of recently, right, this has become a really fast growing field. I think, right, so also the education, or when you think about factors that kind of need to happen for that scale to happen, it's definitely, I think, educating not just consumers, but also businesses, and whether that's also VCs or accelerators to have them understand the importance of that transition towards a circular business model as well. I don't work directly in fundraising, so I don't really want to speak to, scalability in that sense. But I will say as a whole, I think the field is becoming a little bit more receptive to new and innovative technologies like AlgaeNet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as it must do, given, we talked about the role of innovation and technology being so critical as it is in other aspects of the way our world is changing. So great points there. And Camille, turning to you, again, you come from a business that is focusing in this space. What would you say are the key levers that need to be pulled to embrace this agenda?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So I guess I'll caveat my response by saying I don't think there's any technology that will save us. I think we fundamentally need to produce so much less than we currently are. So going back to your slides, Wesley, when you see those like staggering numbers when it comes to the waste volume at the production level. I just really think we need to focus a lot of the solutions in that area, but also just as a culture and as a society, get comfortable with having less out there. So I'll say that first, but that being said, and kind of putting that to the side, I think there's a ton of really exciting approaches and technologies in the space that I'm personally excited about. So one in particular is this concept of regenerative fashion. So I think, Wesley, you mentioned that as well. And I know I've been learning about just regenerative agriculture in general and how those practices are being used in textile production. And it's almost going back to more indigenous practices and things that we did, you know, many years ago, and getting back to the roots of how can we feed the earth rather than constantly extracting from the earth as we're thinking about textile production. And so I think there's a lot of really cool stuff going on in that space. I'm out in California, a company called Fibershed. I've been learning a lot about them. They're working in that space and also embracing more regional textile production. So I think we're gonna have to get really creative, but I would encourage us not to say, hey, we can just figure it out through technology, and there'll be something. We're gonna absolutely need technology, but we also just need less stuff.
Just to piggyback on that, right? Yeah, I think like the notion that we need to become more conscious consumers, I think should be first and foremost on our minds. And to your point, Camille, like that's really at the end of the day what needs to happen. And until we can, you know, reach that mind state, yeah, like I guess the technologies will have to do. But I think that's such a great point, because yeah, at the end of the day, that's really what we need to think about.
Mm. Absolutely. And how do we, maybe from your experiences or just from your own behaviors, how do some of those shifts happen with the consumers, right? How do we encourage people to buy less, to repair, you know, to look at re-commerce options and secondary markets and things? You know, because everyone, similar with our, you know, our phones, we all want the latest models and the best styles, and you know, how do you encourage consumers to make that shift? Maybe Camille, to continue on your point.
Yeah, it's so tough because I think it's very easy to say, okay, we should just be willing to spend more, and this is important and it's good for the planet. But I think what's important in this journey is just meeting people where they are. And so I think a lot of us on this call are extremely privileged. So the fact that I'm wearing one of my favorite sustainable fashion blazers, this blazer was like $200 or something. I don't know that I would have spent that, you know, 10 years ago or been able to. And so I'm in a point where I can do that, but I also don't think it's reasonable to expect that everybody can, you know, just spend what it costs to really invest in sustainable fashion, which is just a much higher price point. And that's just the reality of it. But I think it's starting where you are and doing what you can. So certainly like getting more use out of the things you have. I know my grandmother was always someone who said, you know, if you have style, you don't need to actually buy the latest things all of the time, because you can make do with what you have and be just as fashionable. And so I love the work, you know, for example, that Gianna is doing to help make those connections and show people what is possible with what you have. But it's also just not up to the consumers, because it's certainly a consumption aspect of it, but consumption alone, again, we can't consume our way out of this problem either. So I'm really keen on let's meet people where they are and not be judgmental in this. I think there's also a lot of judgment in this space around, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that, or, oh, you shop at Zara. It's like, I shop at Zara, but I like have that one thing that I bought and I still wear it 10 years ago. And I think that that's okay. So I think it's gradual steps and being kind with each other and starting where you are.
Yeah. And Gianna, I see you really nodding along there and smiling. So do you want to maybe add a bit from your perspective of how do you enable conscious consumption?
Yeah, I have so many snaps for Camille. I was like over here making all kinds of noise. I think all of those were fantastic points. I use what you have is one of my my favorite things before you buy something, try to use what you have first. I think there's this funny, because consumerism is just so part of the culture that we live in. There's sort of this funny thing that we do, and we see the like latest and greatest sustainable thing that we want to ditch all of our plastic Tupperware because we really should be using tin or glass. Or you want to ditch whatever kitchen items you have because you should be using a bamboo toothbrush instead of a plastic toothbrush, but really you're just throwing away the plastic toothbrush anyway. So trying to use what you have before buying anything to replace it, to be more sustainable, or to feel like you filled that quota. I'm a huge fan of Poshmark. Anytime I see something that I really love that's newer from a brand I really like, I check Poshmark first to see if it's there, see if I can get it secondhand. I think that's an awesome way to tell people, not only can you save money on the same exact stuff that you love online, but it can be gently worn, which is awesome. Then we can hopefully curb how much is consistently being churned out and made. I think the last thing is, speaking of really going back to basics, is this idea of swapping with your do it with your siblings, with your friends, but there are even companies now. I have a membership at a company called Swap Society. It's basically a points-based thing where you send in things from your closet that you're done wearing for now. And then those points kind of accumulate and you get to pick things from other people's closets that you want to rotate into your closet now. So there are so many options. And I think, meeting people where they're at, but letting them know like all of these things are options and they don't necessarily have to be very expensive. They can be pretty attainable, especially when you use what you have before you buy anything else.
So it goes back to that point of it on doing your homework and educating yourself on the options that are out there, which might not be as traditional. So again, Camille, you called out, consumers. We've talked a little bit about technology and innovation. A lot of people on this call, I imagine, are potentially, business students or work in larger businesses. What would you say is the role of organizations, corporate organizations in the fashion industry in supporting this, right? Because they can have a huge impact based on their scale, and the amount of people they touch in their consumer base, in their supply chain, and so on and so forth. So would love to hear each of your perspectives on, where do businesses need to step up to make these choices easier and more accessible? Maybe Max, to start with you.
Sure, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, I think like we all have a different perspective, right? From the perspective of, right, creating a material. What I can think of off the top of my head is really trying to make that as cost efficient as possible. Because otherwise, one, you have to meet the properties, right, that brands want for a given material. But if it's not cost efficient, right, the odds of them picking it up are way less likely. And so has to do with scale as well, right? And that's the battle that we're facing right now is being able to meet a scale where these materials can be available at the cost that brands are looking for. If you give me a moment, I'll think of some more things, but I think that's a good way to get the discussion kicked off.
That's a very important one, though, because it's interesting. There's loads of surveys out there that, and I even called it out myself, of what consumers intend to do, right? Everyone wants to do better if they're given the choice, but they'll do better if it costs the same, if the quality is the same. And but they probably won't if it's not, right? If it's much more expensive, or they have to take a cut in terms of the quality standards that they expect. So I think that's actually a really good example of where things need to move to is price, unfortunately, it comes first. Like we know that when you actually go to the purchasing decisions, it will be, be number one for a lot of consumer groups.
Right.
Camille.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry, I was just going to say,
No,
right.
no, go ahead. Yeah.
Oftentimes it's not the brand who's footing the bill, right? It's the consumer. So if we can that's another thing, but kind of changing that way of doing business, that can go a long way towards making, more ecologically conscious clothes and materials more accessible.
Absolutely. Again, Camille, I was going to come to you as well because I see you nodding.
There's so many thoughts here. I love this question because it does shift it away from the consumers into the other stakeholders that certainly play such a huge role in this. And I think from the business perspective, at least in the US right now, a lot of the folks who are participating in the sustainable fashion space and beginning to adopt more circular models, it's all voluntary, right? Like there's no, again, I'm speaking on behalf of the US, I think the EU certainly has a lot more regulation around this, but it's opt-in. It's absolutely like, we think this is good, and either whether that's from consumer demand or pressures as to why they want to participate, or, we talked a little bit about greenwashing. I do think at the end of the day is a lot about the bottom line. Like, I think, we all went to Bentley, absolutely a business school. We learned the business fundamentals. What I'm excited about is that businesses are starting to understand the inherent value that they can create and extract from participating in these types of models. And so to give you a clearer example of that, you're starting to see so many fashion brands in particular start to embrace these both re-commerce models, resale models, upcycling models. And while I would love to believe it's just from the goodness of their hearts, what I really think it's from is there's value here. I love what Levi's does and has been doing actually for quite some time, and working with different partners. But I think everybody knows 501s, they last forever, right? And so there's value in these products that they're putting back out into the ecosystem, and brands are beginning to understand, like there's this whole market that's happening outside of us. How do we actually tap into that in a way that makes sense, and in a way that we can actually bring that back into our business model? Another favorite brand of mine, Mara Hoffman, actually just started her own community online where she's beginning to offer a resale platform and community on her site. And though I do think that that particular organization fundamentally does care about these issues, again, it's another way to create community. It's another way to bring in another potential revenue line to your business. And so I'm excited that brands are beginning to recognize the value that exists there. When I say value, I mean business value, because the reality is, at least in the US up until now, it is voluntary and it is opt-in. And so we do need to rely on that lever. I do think that what's interesting, and Wesley, I'm sure you know a lot more about this being in London, is the models that are happening in the EU are really exciting. And there's a lot of interesting things happening there that I think are creating a more substantial shift in fashion in that space.
Yeah, two really good points there, Camille. I think certainly I can only echo what you say. My work is focused on helping companies look at circularity as I said at the start, as a driver to do good, right? And that is critical, but it's also a driver for value. And that's where you get the attention of, the CFO of a company or the CEO to say, actually, no, this is a new way we can, work. This is a new channel we can provide, or a way for us to, get more brand loyalty. And there's a number of different value levers, as you call out, that are important, and that can make it sustainable and successful for sure. So really important you called that out. In addition to the policy point, right? So the EU has their Circular Economy Action Plan, which addresses a number of different industries, a number of different points across the value chain where they are telling businesses they need to be more responsible in terms of how they design, through to how do they actually have responsibility for waste from their cycles. So that I believe that regulatory environment will shift in more geographies. EU is definitely leading, but there will be more pressure, I think, from different stakeholder groups that forces change. Like if you think about a different industry, plastics and packaging, companies are shaking in their boots in the FMCG, the fast moving consumer goods space, because they have to pay a price for what ends up as plastic waste now. And that regulatory involvement is changing so quickly and certainly globally. So great point there as well. Just before I get to some audience questions, Gianna, any thoughts on the role of business? You've had such a varied range of experiences. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on, what can the role of companies be, and some of these folks that maybe are on the line that work in bigger organizations.
Yeah, I think really similar to what has been said, it starts with the consumer, because corporations will do what makes them money. So if we, although it's opt-in, if we demand better of them, if we are shopping elsewhere, if we are giving our money, if our money is going to other corporations' pockets or other people's pockets, because we want them to be more sustainable, to engage in circularity, to pay garment workers, they'll get there. And unfortunately, the money's kind of generally the name of the game, but it's that vote with your wallet concept. Vote with your dollar. Put it to where you want to see grow and where you want to see that continual change.
Great point. Absolutely. And I see there's quite a few audience questions coming in, so I might pivot to those. I know I'm firing away here, but great to make sure we're including some of the great questions from our audience. So I'll just call out a few, which I think are quite interesting. Hopefully we'll get to as many as possible. And feel free, any of you, to answer this. So the first question I see here is, in the opinion of the panelists, what is the best way to start to incorporate sustainable practices into brands that are focused on, price point, on cost, on making money, on growing? Do you have thoughts on that? It's a really good question off the back of the last one we discussed. Anyone like to go first?
I think a framework for thinking about it is actually kind of, again, going back to that wheel that Wesley shared, is just where are you within that ecosystem? I think depending on where you are, that's going to obviously influence what your value prop is going to be, and like where you're going to be able to make the greatest impact. And so again, with the places that I've worked, kind of being centered more around the re-commerce space, there's just certain things that we're going to be able to do. Like, we don't have any inventory, we don't touch any of that stuff. So there's just things we're not going to be able to do. And so I think it's just really having very clear understanding of where you play within the ecosystem. I love Max's earlier example of, being a textile and being on the materials end and focusing on, okay, like, how do we get costs down? Because if we can figure out how to create something amazing and get costs down, and it's what brands want, then like that is the perfect kind of like Venn diagram, if you will. So to me, it's just understanding like where exactly are you playing, and then how do you meet kind of like the value of, okay, this is what we're trying to achieve, but obviously like this is the business need we're trying to meet, and find your place in the middle. So it's not a good answer other than I think you have to think about it in terms of a framework.
Well, to your point, right, I feel like a lot of brands, you would hope they would, but they probably don't even know where they fit on that loop, right? So taking that first step to even educate themselves is like a way to get it started. But like you said, it really depends on the industry that you're in, right? So like you said, for us, whether it's cutting costs or as a company being more sustainable as well, like there's different things you can do. But yeah.
Yeah, and of course there's like industry thing. I guess what I was referring to is the industry too, but I think also just as an organization, there's of course things that you can do internally to make sure that, you know, your building is up to code, and like
Yeah,
small
B
things
Corp,
like getting rid of water bottles.
Yeah.
And I try not to focus on those little things, but there are absolutely actions that can be taken there as well, just in terms of how you do business.
For sure. Absolutely. And it goes back to, you know, what is value for you in this space, and how can you associate that with different roles and responsibilities in the organization? So what does that mean for HR? You know, it means something different than what it means for the marketing and sales team versus the, you know, operations and production folks. So it's also breaking down that value point you raised, Camille, to what's your role as a whole, as an organization, and then where does that break down across different groups within the organization? Because this is certainly something that is not siloed to sustainability, right? This is business transformation, and I really believe that, and I think that's what a lot of organizations are starting to think about. So I've seen another question in here, are kind of a good add-on to what we're discussing, which is, if you look across the different circular business models, so, you know, we talked about the inputs, Max, your sort of business, how do you reinvent what the products are themselves, to, you know, re-commerce, resale, to how do you take things back and dispose of them safely and successfully. The question's really around, what are the areas that are least mature? So maybe what are some areas that need investment in order to fully close the loop? Max,
I mean,
go ahead.
like, yeah, and feel free to add on to this. I think, like, I'll just call out two things, right? There's very clearly not enough options for like renewable or regenerative biodegradable materials on the market. So that's like why Alumnae is business, but that's why there needs to be more growth and investment in that sector as well. But I don't know if this is maybe like the elephant in the room, but like, why aren't we putting more money into like making recycling more efficient? For example, I feel like this is such a lost cause that like, we just acknowledge that it's, yeah, we don't know what happens to our recycling after, you know, we put it in the bin, but, you know, I'm not sure what the numbers are, our investment in that sector as well, but that just comes to mind because I know it's such an like underutilized and like forgotten about aspect of the circular.
Or things aren't able to be recycled, especially in textiles. There are a lot of materials that there is no recycling solution. So that's a really great point. Obviously, we'd love to keep things in the loop, but when they do ultimately need to be recycled, and there's no other pathways that are up that sort of waste hierarchy, there's a real lack in mechanical and chemical recycling, which are
they
both
have to be made to be recycled.
So really good point. Yeah. Gianna, Camille, anything to add on that point? We've got a few more questions, but keen to hear.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with Max.
Great. Wonderful. So just looking across the list here, there's a comment in terms of looking at, you know, some of the producers of our goods, right? Mainly focused in the developing world, like India and China. And given, especially right now, you know, with India in a very difficult place, but also through the pandemic, right? There's been a real impact on the supply chain, and, you know, supplies not getting to where they need to be, or stocks being overfilled. What do you say is you know, some of those big challenges that are faced regarding the issues around the supply chain disruptions with COVID and maybe with other sorts of crises moving forward?
I hate to keep jutting in here, but I guess to me, this really calls out the need for that localization of the supply chain, which inherently is way more sustainable than having something shipped from across the world. But yeah, I mean, I know of several companies or people that work at companies who were experiencing shortages in materials, and they had to source them locally. And for better or worse, right? Maybe they paid a higher price in the beginning, but they've been able to bring their manufacturing and sourcing local. So I guess that's one thought there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would tend to agree, right? Creating resilient supply chains is very much about how do you diversify, create local scenarios, and also prepare for some of these disruptions, which we know COVID has been so severe in terms of how it's disrupted, especially certain industries. But, if we look at the climate crisis, and therefore, which is very linked to the circular challenges, there are going to be these disruptions. So there has to be more flexibility built into supply chains, and also on the social side, right? Being able to look after the individuals in the supply chain in a much better way than has been done in the past. And there's some quite bad behavior during COVID of, companies in the fashion industry, for example, not honoring their contracts with suppliers and so on. So certainly a lot that needs to be thought through. And I think there are a lot of organizations taking that step. We have a few more questions, but I'm actually conscious we only have 2 minutes left. So clearly there's huge interest in hearing from you all and on this topic. But I'd like to actually close with a brief question to each of you. I guess just to call out to the audience and the listeners today, what would you really say is the one, I guess, action that you would like the audience to take away from this call and from all of your musings you've done on this topic? So what would be the takeaway that you would give, and sort of a statement each to the audience members that will hopefully inspire them to get more involved in this space moving forward? I'll maybe start with you, Gianna.
Sure. I think I'm going to go back to education, but more importantly, which I think we've started to talk about, is making sure the information that you're getting is from a place that's credible. And so nonprofits like Remake, you have 4 people right here who have some sort of knowledge base, using certain apps, just kind of leveraging what you're in control of, and educating yourself on what you and your little sphere can do to be better. And I think piggybacking a little bit off of that is just don't feel the impulse to consume to be better. Use what you've got first, and then use your education to make a good decision on where to go next.
Great point. So really about empowering the individual. I like that a lot. Max, turning to you next.
Yeah, I don't want to cheat and say something similar to you, Gianna, but I guess for me as a consumer myself, one thing I've learned or one thing I'm trying to get a lot better at is doing that. I mean, let's call it education, but also for me, it's research. And before I'm going to put my money into something as an individual, I need to do that research and make sure that it's going to the right place, and that, the impact of the company I'm buying from isn't environmentally detrimental at the end of the day. Right. That's really just, I guess, a re-articulating what you're saying, Gianna. But yeah, I would just say do the research. And it's so much easier said than done, but be a more conscious consumer.
Last but not least, Camille.
Yeah, I mean, certainly echo what the other panelists have shared around education. I think that, again, I don't believe we'll be able to buy our way out of this challenge. But going back to I think Gianna, you made this point earlier, collectively as consumers, we have so much power. And I don't just mean buying power, I just mean even just the pressures that you can put on organizations to demand more from them. It's very, very, very significant. And so I fundamentally do not believe in cancel culture, but I totally believe in accountability culture. And that's calling organizations in, slipping into their DMs and asking them questions about what they're doing, actually applying the pressure. And of course, that would require you to be a little bit educated about it, but also just, ask the question. And I think it goes a longer way than you might think. because obviously these companies do want to keep themselves top of mind for you. And so I would just encourage you to use that power and don't minimize the impact that you can have. And it certainly can be $1, but it also can be other avenues as well. And so I would encourage everyone to embrace that.
Well, that's a really fantastic point to add at the end, right? So it's how do you really turn to action? And I think that's a point that's important for individuals, but also for businesses of all types, whether they be in the public or private sector. It's really think about what is your role. You know, this agenda, this movement is coming. I can say that very clearly from working in this space for the last 10 years. You know, the changes and the momentum that's growing and the increased focus over time. So I think, you know, making sure people are educated, making sure, you know, they're conscious and that they're taking action in a personal and professional perspective is key. So you don't get left behind. And so you are empowering the more good. So fantastic insights from all of you. I'm sorry we haven't gotten to all the questions, but potentially we can try and answer some of those offline as well. But really, really grateful for being a part of this discussion and being able to speak to all of you. And with that said, I will turn back over to Emily to close out the session.
Thank you, Wesley, and thank you to Camille and Gianna and Max. You guys were wonderful. What a great engaged audience we had today. And we're just so pleased. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll send out a follow-up email with the recording as well as a way to connect with our panelists. Thanks again and have a great day.